Francisco de Goya stands like a boundary marker between centuries, his art bridging the gilded elegance of the Enlightenment and the blood-soaked horrors of the modern age. He began his career as a painter of courtly portraits, designing tapestries that glittered with pastoral charm, and chronicling the nobility of Spain with a sharp but respectful brush. But the man who ended his life in exile was not the same man who once painted smiling duchesses. Disease, political turmoil, war, and personal tragedy left him transformed. By the end, Goya was deaf, sickly, isolated, and haunted by visions that seemed to claw their way out of his inner darkness and into the plaster walls of his home. Between 1819 and 1823, 14 images painted directly onto the plaster walls of his villa. Never intended for public eyes, never titled or explained by the artist himself. They were discovered only after his death, stripped from the crumbling house decades later. And today they hang in the Museo del Prado in Madrid like a gallery of nightmares, preserved in oil and silence. To encounter the black paintings is not to see art in the conventional sense, but to stand in the wake of a mind that had stared into the abyss and allowed the darkness to flow through his brush. They are not decorative. They are not polite. They are oppressive, heavy with an atmosphere that feels ominous. Viewers speak of unease, of discomfort, even of dread. For in these works, the old master called upon demons that may not have been his alone, but the devils of an entire age of violence and despair. Between 1819 and 1823, within the walls of his Madrid residence, the Quinta del Sordo, translated The House of the Deaf Man, Goya created the works that posterity would call the Pintores Negras, or Black Paintings. To enter the villa in those years must have felt like stepping into a sanctuary of shadows, a place where the air was thick with unspoken thoughts and invisible griefs. On its walls, Goya painted directly, in oils so dark and earthy they seemed more like pigments drawn from soil, blood, and ash than from a painter's palette. There were no commissions, no patrons to impress, only the deaf painter, his brush, and the ghosts that pressed against him in the silence. He gave no titles. The names by which we know them: Saturn Devouring His Son, Witch's Sabbath, Two Old Men Eating Soup, were given later, imposed by curators who struggled to categorize what they saw. That very absence of explanation is itself unsettling. Goya left us no key, no legend, no justification, only images, raw and terrible. Of the 14, none has burned itself more deeply into our collective nightmares than Saturn Devouring His Son. Be in it the Titan, Saturn, fearing the prophecy that he will be overthrown by one of his children, consumes his offspring whole. In earlier centuries, Rubens painted the same myth with Baroque grandeur and allegory, a scene draped in mythic majesty. But Goya strips it to its marrow. The figure of Saturn looms in darkness, his eyes wide with animal terror, his mouth stretched into a grotesque wound as he tears at the limp body of his child. There is no setting, no mythological grandeur, only a hunched, wild-eyed monster, naked, alone, and crazed by hunger. The child's body is pale and headless, more carcass than person. Viewers often report a visceral reaction to this painting: revulsion, nausea, or a chill that feels more physical than intellectual. Saturn here is not a mythic god, but a portrait of insanity itself, the devouring of his own bloodline, the cannibalism of a father who fears the future so much he destroys it. One sees not just the myth, but the shadow of Spain itself, a country devouring its people in war, famine, and repression. And perhaps more personally, one sees Goya himself, old and sick, peeling the gnawing terror of time consuming him. At the opposite pole of intensity lies the dog, the most minimal, the most enigmatic, and perhaps the most haunting of all the black paintings. Against a vast field of ochre, a small, almost abstract dog's head peers upward, barely visible, its body swallowed by shadow. Above it stretches an overwhelming emptiness, heavy and oppressive. There is almost nothing there, yet the silence of the painting screams. The tiny, helpless creature seems on the verge of drowning in a sea of nothingness. And its upward gaze is ambiguous: hope, fear, desperation, or a final plea to an uncaring sky. Critics have called it a meditation on mortality, on the insignificance of life against the crushing weight of the void. Visitors often describe it as the loneliest painting in the world. In its simplicity lies its terror. No demons, no gore, no monsters only, the unbearable vastness of nothing, and a fragile living thing poised to vanish into it. If the dog whispers its dread, witch's Sabbath shrieks it. The painting shows a massive, looming black goat, the devil in rustic Spanish folklore, surrounded by a ring of witches. Their faces are grotesque, their bodies twisted, their eyes wide with madness. Some raise their arms in worship, others recoil in fear. The goat itself dominates the scene, horned, inhuman, a presence that seems to radiate doom. This is no romanticized witchcraft scene like those painted for curious aristocrats. This is feverish, mocking, sinister. The painting may reflect Goya's contempt for superstition, or his horror at the resurgence of irrationality in a Spain shackled by the Inquisition and reactionary politics. Or it may be more personal still, a vision of helpless humans gathered around a void, worshipping destruction because it is all they know. The crowd of witches seems both frenzied and lifeless, as if hypnotized. Their gathering feels less like a celebration and more like a funeral. The black goat, eyes hidden in darkness, towers above them, the master of a meaningless rite. Few paintings so effectively embodied disgust as two old men eating soup. Two figures huddled together, their faces cadaverous, their flesh sagging and rotted. One shovels food into his mouth with monstrous greed. The other stares, vacant and corpse-like. The background is black, the air suffocating. What are we seeing? Senility, starvation, or perhaps a grotesque parody of communion, the sacrament reduced to animal feeding. The painting reeks of decay, not just physical, but spiritual. Old age here is not wisdom, but grotesquerie. The body reduced to hunger and the mind to vacancy. Viewers often describe this work as nauseating, unforgettable. It is a painting one wishes to look away from, but cannot. What is most chilling about the black paintings is that they were not public works. They were not commissioned, not meant for sale or display. They were, for Goya, alone, painted in the rooms where he ate, slept, and walked. Imagine living surrounded by these images day and night. Saturn gnawing flesh, witches cavorting around the goat, decrepit men gnashing at soup, phantoms processing in darkness. It was as if Goya built his own haunted house, a labyrinth of nightmares from which he could not escape. Whether he painted them as catharsis, mockery, or sheer compulsion, we cannot know. But one thing is certain: he did not intend them for the polite gaze of museum visitors. Their very survival is an accident of history. After Goya's death, the house changed owners, and decades later the images were transferred from plaster to canvas. That act preserved them, but also tore them from their original context. In the Prado today, they hang on white walls, lit by modern lights, surrounded by crowds. Yet even stripped of their claustrophobic home, they radiate dread. The absence of titles or explanations is itself haunting. We do not know what Goya called these works, or if he named them at all. We cannot know what he thought of them, or whether he saw them as exorcism, satire, or simply private madness. This silence allows them to function like mirrors. Each viewer projects into them their own dread, their own unease. One sees political despair, another sees madness, another sees death. The black paintings absorb us, and in return they reflect our darkest selves. The black paintings remain, nearly 2 centuries later, among the most disturbing works of art ever created. They resist domestication. They refuse to be fully explained. They are relics of one man's descent into silence and shadow. Yet they feel universal, as if the brush had tapped into something older and darker than any single life. Goya's black paintings are not haunted in the folkloric sense. No spirits move within them. No footsteps echo in their frames. And yet they haunt us. They are paintings that refuse to remain flat, that reach out across centuries, that leave a residue in the mind. They remind us that darkness is not only in the past, but ever present, crouching at the edges of vision. To stand before them is to stand in a room Goya built for himself, a room where silence was filled with screams only he could hear. It is to inherit his nightmares, to feel the weight of his despair, and to glimpse the shadows he left behind.